Hello, this is Forever Loading, and today we are diving into part 2 of how Sega could have salvaged the Saturn. If you haven't seen my first video on this topic, I really recommend you go watch that first. I'll do a quick recap of the basic points I covered before, and then I'll jump right in. 1. Scrap the 32X. It was unnecessary, wasted resources, and fractured the user base. 2. No surprise launch. It only pissed off retailers and developers. 3. More legacy flagship titles. The Genesis had a stellar library of popular games. More sequels and spin-offs of these should have been made. 4. More Western developed games. Secure those devs. Keep them in the loop. 5. More popular Japanese games released overseas. So much of the Saturn's best was left in Japan. Importing now, and even back then, was often resorted to. That's about it for the points in part 1. I hope you've given it a look for more details and context moving forward. Also, before we dive in, just a reminder again that these are all hypotheticals. I know that in reality, the Saturn had a hard future ahead of it from the very start. This is just for fun. Okay, with all that said, let's go and start with game packaging and design. The first point of the day is a simple one, but it's still very important: the game packaging. First of all, the cases are fragile. The plastic is brittle. Cracks form if you just breathe on them a little too hard. The hinges wear out and break off very easily as well. The design flaws go beyond the outer casing. The size and shape of many of the cases make it easy for discs to come loose and rattle around inside. Sega often resorted to including a little foam brick inside to stop this from happening. Multi-disc games usually have the extra discs and a flimsy sleeve that didn't protect discs well either. On top of all this, replacing a broken case, which many Saturn collectors have had to do on occasion, is a pain and a half because these oddly shaped boxes aren't common. If you want to transplant the manual, game, and insert to a new case, the most common way to do so is to cannibalize the cheaper, less desirable game. The long boxes also made it seem like Sega was stuck in the past alongside the Sega CD. It's true that Sony also used long boxes in the US at the start of the PlayStation's lifespan, but they had the sense to shift to more durable, mainstream jewel cases very early on. Sega of America, at least, was better off than European Saturn fans, however, who were stuck with even flimsier cases, sometimes made of cardboard. Sega Saturn cases might look neat lined up on a shelf, but in reality, they are bulky and don't fit with other CD/DVD cases or insert easily into a standard CD rack. The change in size from the Japanese standard jewel cases also often made it harder to adapt the Japanese box art, and it's no secret that the US Saturn library is home to some lousy box art. It's not TurboGrafx ugly, but there's still some uggos in there. If they went with jewel cases, they could repurpose the original art easier, and that would usually look much better. In fact, I can only think of one example where the Western box art is better than the original Japanese. If Sega had stuck to the standard jewel case design and packaging that they were doing in Japan, they would have saved money that they desperately needed. Standard cases are not only more reliable, but they're also insanely common. If they went this route, they could have used the original art more often. They could cut down on costs for commissioning or redesigning new art, and who knows, maybe they could have built a more identifiable brand by showcasing more anime or Japanese style art when the competitors weren't often doing so. It's plain to see that Sega would have done themselves a favor by utilizing the Japanese-style packaging and design in the West. However, packaging alone couldn't save the Saturn, as games couldn't be easily developed for it. And sadly, that was the case for the Saturn. The Sega Saturn was notoriously difficult to program for, especially when it came to 3D games. Even the best of Sega's internal development teams had trouble with the 32-bit hardware. Yu Suzuki, the mind behind Shenmue, even spoke of the difficulty Sega's best programmers had with the hardware. The Saturn's design was finalized in a late-game scramble, more or less. They hastily added another processor to try and make it compete with the PlayStation and make it easier to adapt the Model 1 arcade games. As a result, it didn't start its life with a large number of sophisticated development kits. The best thing Sega could have done was go for a totally different system design, but since the series is focused on how Sega could have salvaged the Saturn after release, we're going to focus on how the established hardware affected game development. This was a problem for Sega themselves, but it was even more of a dilemma for second and third-party developers. Sega didn't produce or share enough of its precious dev tools to other developers, especially Western ones. This led to long development times, and in the case of the Saturn's flagship Sonic title, Sonic X-Treme, a chaotic ride that ultimately ended in its cancellation. Sony, by contrast, spent a lot of time building the PlayStation around 3D development, and did their best to invest in creating and distributing these tools to as many developers as they could, in the East and the West. Sega really should have put more effort into creating more accessible dev kits, and spreading them around to as many game studios as possible. If they had made this effort in both the East and the West, they probably would have had more games come out in a more polished state. It also would have been easier for game developers to include the Saturn with multi-platform releases. This would be much easier for Sega if they had followed my hypothetical point about the 32X in Part 1. If Sega wasn't so fractured with their focus, all of their time and resources could have been put towards the Saturn and given Sega more of a leg up before the Saturn even released. If the 32X was never part of the picture, game development and tools could have possibly turned out much different. Once more games were being made more often and more competently, the next step would be to advertise them well and get the gaming public's attention. Sega fumbled the Saturn's marketing in North America. They fell into a rut of extreme or wacky 90s ads from the Genesis era and carried these points onward with the Saturn. That is, when they bothered to promote the thing at all. These ads range from abrasive and annoying to just plain stupid. Many of them revolved around trash-talking their competitors and just highlighted a narrow set of games. This may have worked with the Genesis, but at least with that platform, Sega was consistently putting out new and varied software, as well as multi-platform titles that went alongside what Nintendo could do. We already know that Sega didn't always bring their best to the West, and ignored some games that showed off the Saturn's strengths. So, when they did show off in advertisements, it just came off as petty or tasteless. Marketing in Japan didn't start off with anything phenomenal, but they at least were more consistent and put more of an emphasis on the actual games they were showcasing. Sega of Japan did everything they could to push the Saturn to a successful space, and they did. The Saturn outdid the N64 in that region. It took a couple of years, but they created a stellar and still memorable campaign with the character Segata Sanshiro, who, well, Just take a look.
OK
お前ら今日はやったよ。
任しとけ。
セガと三四郎。
セガタ三四郎。
セガサターンしろ。
高速ハリネズミソニックのレースゲームソニック R。
セガサターン。
That's so fun and cool, right? Sega really needed an equivalent of that in the West. And I think a more or less straight adaptation would have done well. But unfortunately, by the time Segata Sanshiro came around, higher ups at Sega of America had changed to people like Bernie Stolar, who wanted to bury the Saturn system fast and start anew, and well, that just wasted an awful lot in the process. I realized that in reality, Sega couldn't really wait. But since this is a series of escalating hypotheticals and follows earlier suggestions, let's dive into this. Bernie Stolar, as a whole, was a mistake. By announcing the Dreamcast so early and dismissing the Saturn, Sega lost consumer loyalty, which was already damaged by the 32X and to a lesser degree, the Sega CD. According to Sega Retro, at E3 1997, there were roughly 68 games featured and announced for the Sega Saturn. After that conference, about 23 of those games were either cancelled, shifted to other systems, or did not get a US release. If you look at the releases, the Saturn had a steady stream through 1995 and 1996, but it started to slow in 1997. Only 7 Saturn games were released in the US throughout 1998. NHL 98, Winter Heat, Panzer Dragoon Saga, The House of the Dead, Burning Rangers, Shining Force 3, and Magic Knight Rare. Japan had a successful 1997 and 1998 with many quality releases. By declaring total lack of faith in the Saturn and announcing a successor so early, Sega pissed off important, faithful, third-party Japanese developers. This ended up not only hurting the Saturn, but also Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. Sega should have been more vocal and supportive of the Saturn. Referring to it as stillborn and not the future just killed it entirely before Sega was ready for the future. If the previous points I have mentioned were taken into account, it would have been easier for Sega to continue with the Saturn until the Dreamcast was ready for launch. Sega wouldn't have been hemorrhaging money quite as badly through 1998, and consumers and developers would have had a warmer reception to the Dreamcast when it was desperately needed. Sega made a lot of mistakes. It can't be denied that the Saturn and how it was handled internationally was one of them. To their credit, Sega learned a lot from these mistakes, and it shows with their next and last game console, the Dreamcast. The Saturn furthered a ripple effect of misfortune. In reality, it may have been unsalvageable. The hardware may have been too complex and a bad decision from the start. And the dominoes were already falling for Sega. That being said, I still really love the platform. The 32-bit era was a transitional period for all of gaming. There was a lot of learning to be done, and no one made the transition to 3D gaming perfectly or gracefully. You can't turn back time, but it's important to note that the problem wasn't with Sega's game development teams. There are plenty of games still worth playing today that can still only be found on the Saturn. The failure of the Sega Saturn was not a reflection of the quality or creativity of those that made games for it. In the end, I'm still a huge fan of Sega and the Saturn. It deserved a fighting chance, and maybe on another plane at a different time, it had one. I'm just happy people are starting to give it more attention and respect these days. The bad or unfortunate decisions made don't take away from the fun that can be had with all of Sega's 32-bit beast. And when all is said and done, isn't fun what video games are all about? I'd say so. This has been my series on how Sega could have salvaged the Saturn. I'm not sure if I'll do a part 3, so I'll just say this is the end for now. Thank you so much for tuning in and checking this out. If you like the video I've made, or other videos I've made, please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, tell your friends, tell your ma, all the things. I'd really appreciate it, and it helps me out an awful lot. I'll see you guys later with some more videos on different topics. Have a good night. Goodbye.